The year is 1996. The digital world is in its infancy, and Moonlight Maze, the world's first major publicly known cyberespionage campaign, gets underway, targeting government and military networks in search of sensitive information. The attack began with an exploit that allowed the attackers to dump the password lists of various servers. Victims of Moonlight Maze include the Pentagon, NASA, and the Department of Energy. The FBI and others launch a major investigation and collect a mountain of evidence. Most of this remained classified and is destroyed in 2008. In 2016, we unearthed a time capsule. Moonlight Maze used a complex network of proxies to reach targets and hide its tracks. One of them, a server in the UK, was hijacked by Moonlight Maze, but unbeknown to the attackers, the system administrator turned it against them, recording everything they did. Despite their early interest in operational security, the attackers made a further mistake. They used multiple victim machines infected with sniffers as staging proxies for further attacks. They created a digital footprint that would last through the ages and allow us to reconstruct a small part of the constellation of attacks known as Moonlight Maze. There are more attacks and victims out there in the dark matter we can't see. This investigation is not just about the past. Moonlight Maze set the trend for a modern attacker's toolkit, still active to this day. The threat is still out there, and we won't rest until we find it.
Morning. Hello everyone, my name is Kostin Riley and I'm the founder of an organization called Paleontology Matters, who enjoys alcohol and searching for old APTs. Our goal is to look into all things and to try to understand what people behind us did wrong so we don't do it again. So I think that paleontology is a very important thing because it teaches us the mistakes of the past. I remember in 1996, probably there are people here in the audience who were not born in 1996, I guess. But let me tell you something. In 1996, I joined the Faculty of Computer Science in Bucharest. And this was an amazing place to be at that time because it was a home of some of the best hackers in the world. So there were people in this faculty who would wake up at 5, take the metro, and go to a magic room that was called ED011. And from this room, they were hacking into ARMY.MIL, they were hacking into NASA.gov, simply to challenge each other and to see who has the most root shells on ARMY.MIL. And I watched all these people in amazement because back then I was very young and my interest was mostly on the defense side of things. But I've seen that all these people, the reason they were doing it was just for fun. And I think that if we look back in 1996, 99% of all the high-profile hacks were just enthusiasts. They were, kids challenging each other to see who can access the most data. And only 1% of all the high-profile hacks were government-sponsored. What has changed since 1996? I think nowadays the situation is exactly opposite. We have maybe 1% of all the high-profile hacks which are done by hacktivists, just like Phineas Fisher, for instance, and 99% of the hacks are now government-sponsored. So it's a huge paradigm change that happened in these 20 years. We moved from, let's say, 1% of government-sponsored hacking to 99% of government-sponsored hacking for all high-profile incidents. So it's been a great pleasure for me to look into Moonlight Maze and to try to understand exactly what happened 20 years ago and what we need to do in the future in order not to repeat the same mistakes and in order to see what we can do to have better defense and to avoid such situations. So let me pass it to Thomas, who did most of the work here. My part, to be honest, was very little, and it accounted to reverse engineering Sun OS and IRIX binaries for the past 3 weeks, which has been a very challenging experience, I can tell you. But I did learn something new, and it has been a great honor for me to work with Thomas and my other colleagues. Thomas?
Thank you, Kostin.
Thank you.
So, some of you may remember that I was here at the last SAS to speak about my Moonlight Maze research. And at the time, almost all of my research had been talking to people, talking to former investigators. I think I talked to approximately 40 different people who had worked on Moonlight Maze between 1998 and 2000, and it continued, the early 2000s. One of the things that I found is that if you ask the FBI for freedom of information requests, they redact information. But sometimes, still in the reductions, there is interesting detail. So this one is particularly interesting. It's the destruction notice from 2008. And you can see here that they destroyed the forensic evidence available from the case on computer disks. But I still was able to squeeze a lot of interesting detail out of the people I interviewed. This was the Moonlight Maze t-shirt that the FBI made that I mentioned last year, just as a quick refresher. In the investigation, in my conversations, especially with Department of Defense investigators, I heard several times, and from people in different countries, that Moonlight Maze never stopped and continued to the present day, continued to evolve. So we had this fascinating clue that we have an old intrusion set that evolved over 20 years into a new intrusion set. So the question that we were trying to answer is, can we reconstruct this story forensically? Can we basically run a parallel investigation in which we tell the forensic story from Moonlight Maze to TURLA? I note that the name Maker's Mark, and some of my sources mentioned that Maker's Mark was a later code name of Moonlight Maze. The name Maker's Mark shows up in the Snowden leaks, so that made it even more intriguing, obviously. Then something extraordinary happened. Due to a reduction error, I was able to trace down the former administrator of a command and control site, or of a staging server to be more precise, in 1998 and 1999. And while the FBI had destroyed all the forensic data, and other organizations also destroyed all the forensic data, David Hedges, you can see him here on the picture with Danny Moore and Juan, he kept the data. So we were able to reconstruct Moonlight Maze, at least in that 6 months window, in a great level of detail. And this is the actual staging server from back in the day, HR test. So with that, I'll pass on. Thank you. With that, I'll pass on to Danny Moore and Juan Andres Guerrero Sad from Kaspersky, and they will go into the log as well as the binary analysis. But before that, I thought we should celebrate the code naming of this operation.
There's no way you're getting away from this one. Hello, 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 everybody.
Hello.
Let's take a minute, if you don't mind. Whoop, too many microphones, too close together. So for those of you that know us well and have been following this saga, I think nobody necessarily knew what the project was, but this thing has nearly killed us over the past 9 months. So I think if you don't mind a minute with my colleagues, we need to celebrate this code name.
Yeah.
No better chance than this, right?
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. this is, you maybe want to introduce the box?
Yeah, so this is...
Still works.
It still works. This is a 20-year-old Spark station that we very eagerly picked up in order to do some of the tests and hopefully understand some of the malware as well. So first things first. We wanted to really understand how this attack happened. So there's two big things here. Of course, we're going to talk about how this is all evolving into a modern toolkit, and of course we care about that. But we also have a first public glimpse of what happened with Moonlight Maze, which is not anything that's happened before outside of very classified, careful environments. So how about we look at some of these? This is the first thing that Thomas ever showed me. It was this FOIA requested document that actually discussed how some ARMY.MIL systems were getting hit with a CGI bin exploit for PHF. And at the time, that was a binary that was included with HTTPD, with basically any web server was going to have this vulnerable binary in there. And what they were doing was using this exploit, which was totally public. It was released sometime in January 1996. And they were using it to dump password files. So there was nothing insane here. They were literally just getting the password files, and then they were able to just access it legitimately, or semi-legitimately. As we went through some of the stuff that David Hedges shared, we actually found a much larger toolkit, and one that actually shows a certain level of binary evolution and a lot of diverse things. But it looks nothing like what we expect from modern APTs. We're talking mostly about tools, and we're talking about publicly available exploits. And it's probably worth mentioning some of the functionality. I mean, you're going to have, for those of you that are interested, you're going to have plenty of reading material on this for all the samples that Kostin and I were reversing and all the things that we found. But if you want to understand some of the functionality, we're talking kernel patchers for SunOS 2.5, 2.6. You're talking some covert channel backdoors, some redirectors of traffic to be able to tunnel between these different systems. Of course, a keylogger for an X server. Some log cleaners. They had some interest in operational security at the time, so of course they wanted to be able to remove some of the names of their own access to some of these servers. And info stealer scripts. I mean, these guys attempted an early version of automation. It really wasn't like the malware that we're used to now that carries out all these things and just pipes away at a command and control server. These guys were connected the entire time that they needed to send sort of tasking information or exfiltrate things. They had to come in and do this at some point, which is why they were so interested in the relay sites. Danny will tell you a lot more about that. But for a quick overview, I figured let's understand some of this. So how do you pwn ARMY.MIL in 8 simple steps? Which is essentially the competition that Kostin was describing when he was at university. So, of course, you go, you dump the password files, you get access. You pull your tools, you retrieve it from a staging server somewhere. You run some escalation of privilege exploits. Then, with that, with root permissions, you can, deploy your tools, or deploy a sniffer, deploy some backdoors. Then you process the logs right on the box. And actually, that allows you to create these giant lists of IPs and other machines on the network, other machines that this machine has connected to, and you can leverage some of the passwords that you've stolen in order to survey the network, rinse and repeat, and you can have a ton of boxes and hopefully win the competition that was happening at Kostin's University. However, with Moonlight Maze, we can also learn how not to pwn ARMY.MIL in 8 simple steps. You probably shouldn't leave compilation information in the binaries. You probably should not skip your English classes. You should always use the power of the VNUK. If there happen to be any Russians in the audience, VNUK, anyone? All right. Leverage broken tools. Code a bunch of functionality into some new shiny tools and then forget to redirect the execution flow so they don't work. Use the same, possibly infected or turned against you proxy for 6 months. Consistently connect from, somewhere, let's say a consistent work day of 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. somewhere in UTC+3, Use the same ISPs for about 3 years, which end up being essentially the same IPs for about 3 years. And then, this is our favorite, sniff yourself with your own tool. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So meet Max, Iron, and RINAT. These are some of our wonderful operators. You can see that from some of the strings there. They were very eager to compile their my program and my sniffer, my spy client, my exploits. They were very excited about some of these exploits, and I'm afraid their English not so good. So you've got some overt spelling errors. You've got things like hiding complete. You can see some of these over here, receiving message, but also some awkward phrasing. Cannot open socket, error, not connect. Things were not working out all the time. So things were a little complicated. Focusing on the sniffers, they actually, I really enjoy being able to see how the operators grow. They basically went from script kiddie to something that looked a little more like nation state. So they evolved different types of sniffers. So they started with one based on Soul Sniffer from 1994. They adopted the source code, started fixing it up. Didn't really work at the time. Then they just built one with like libpcap and TCP dump. And then they were like, oh, this works. So they combined it into one really good one that they would configure through scripts. And that actually allows us to do something very different. So my friend Danny Moore will take the helm here.
Thank you. Thank you to Juan and the rest of the leather jacket gang over there. I guess I didn't get the memo when coming to the Caribbean. It's 28 degrees Celsius, I'm just saying.
You gotta commit.
Anyway, so looping back on the sniffer modules, I think that was the part where I came into play. I was having a meeting with Thomas, and he relayed to me that one of the files that we received from David was the output of some network capture module. And we were wondering what we can do with this, what we can learn about the behavior of the operators just based on that. So I suggested that maybe I can have a look at it. Maybe we can parse this. Maybe we can reconstruct a kind of network graph that will be instructive to us, because it was kind of divided between a raw network capture and some metadata collected by the malware, and all of that kind of did not come together yet to something that we can learn from. So I started having a look at it, and I started by having a tiny recreation of the graph, which looked like a very simple version of what you see behind me. But then we continued talking to David, and one file turned into 11, and 11 files turned into 40, and we ended up having visibility in quite a sizable chunk of the network. So I put a little bit more effort into it, and I'm not really a UI dev, so I'm sorry if this looks ugly. But that's how this tool, Rapid, was born, which is basically a tool that we developed in order to help us analyze this graph. And what you can see here is basic search functionality that I kind of baked into the tool, and allowing us to visualize different layers of content that we received from the operation itself. So you have the network capture logs that recorded FTP traffic, they recorded POP3 email traffic, they recorded our login and telnet sessions that went on in the network, and I was able to kind of color code this and generate this graph, which also allows you to session match the upstream and downstream of everything. So we did not want to anger the demo gods, so we're not going to have a live show of the UI running, but we should have something. So this is going to play in a second. So just to give you kind of an overview of the graph, we basically got immediate visibility into a chunk of the network. Now, it's not just one network, it's numerous networks spanning dozens of organizations ranging from the US Navy to NASA to the National Oceanographic Institute to a dozen US universities at least, even some institutions worldwide. And you can see this kind of primordial operation in its infancy and just how interconnected all the networks are. So considering how jumbled this whole thing is, we were wondering to ourselves, how can we use this data to build something that means something? How can we sift through all this data and find actual indications of operator behavior? And that proved to be a little difficult because most of the traffic that we saw in there was actually completely innocuous traffic. We saw people just working on the network. Some of it is Navy supercomputers that were being used as a shared resource to do all types of oceanographic calculations. Some of it was just people emailing each other or transferring files. We even saw people downloading video games to their endpoints, even though I imagined that they were not supposed to do that. But we basically got a really complete snapshot that we now had to delve way more deep into. So we did. First of all, we tried to understand how the operators behaved as a whole. So one thing, and Juan mentioned this, is we did a histogram of all the data that we have. And as he mentioned, we saw a lot of traffic coming from Russian dynamic IP addresses, literally Russian ISP dial-ups that were used to facilitate the communication. And there is no room to mistake that that was the case, because we actually saw the exploit bundles being uploaded from Russian-based IP addresses. And as you can see, this is a GMT0 time histogram. It conformed pretty nicely to a GMT +3 workday, where the blue bracket is commands or exploits being uploaded, orange is files being drawn from the staging server, that same HR test that we showed you before, and green is exfiltrated products being shoved back up there. So, we also saw quite a bit of actual exfiltrated data. So we saw images being moved and documents being moved around, and just a little nice tidbit that we found. This is a map, I believe, of a satellite map of sea altitude changes that actually has San Martin on it, so we're quite lucky. This is super relevant to us right now. But we did see quite a lot of product being moved through, but mostly we saw a lot of reconnaissance being conducted. We saw a lot of innocent traffic that was just surreptitiously captured and moved through the network, and that's what we could work off of. So we started doing searches. I was looking for any weird mentions of the exploit bundle names, which were oddly consistent because this was the 90s and they were slightly less concerned about being dynamic about the way they did things. So I was looking for the specific exploit bundle names as they were moving through the server. And one thing I found as a result of that, and this is a search you see highlighted in yellow, you see a search for one of the exploit bundle names. We see a second tier connection here that does not go through the staging server. And I thought to myself, wow, that was weird. So we can see the transfer of the exploit files going from the server to an intermediate. But then when we look at the actual session, we see that one server was used to tunnel to another, where they basically recorded themselves by accident by a network capture model that was on the original server, trying to extract exploits on these yet uncompromised server and trying to run it in sequence. So we basically suddenly had visibility into an entire session that was kind of fossilized by accident as a result of their own exfiltrated data. So this wasn't as much as our forensic investigation as it was data that we actually got from them, so that was very helpful on their end. And this session was pretty complete. We actually see them trying to exploit the server. They're failing. They're grabbing another exploit and failing again. And at the end of it, when they finished their attempt, they just tunneled to a different server. And this was all on University of Illinois servers, tunneling from one to another. I think it was University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign or something like that. But we got to get a pretty complete glimpse into the past, just preserved in those network logs provided to us by David. But that wasn't the only thing we found. We actually found a second complete session that was a result of me searching for the file names used for exfiltration, because they often zip the files and used a name similar to the server it was taken from. And that you can see highlighted. So the two prongs that you see highlighted on the top is basically corresponds to the Russian operators, or the Russian IP operators that grabbed the files later on, but you also see more files moving through the network where they should not be, because that was not the server name that was used. And what we found was another complete session, which we dubbed the OPSEC session, because you can actually see the operators moving through different logs on the server. They were trying to check the auth log and the sys log. They were trying to check the presence of other compromised computers in the session logs that were on this server, so we can actually see fossilized remains of, again, another complete session that relates to a different type of behavior. And one of the interesting things that we saw at the top is them looking at the last session that actively pinged into the server, and we see them trying to look for incoming sessions from HR tests, from the staging server, which is unusual because the only thing we saw of that so far was outbound connections using FTP. So that kind of gave us the indication that there may be a second protocol in play that was used to transfer files or communicate between servers. And that is something that Juan has more to say about.
Well, so we have this fantastic opportunity. We get all these fantastic artifacts, but the truth is that it has a lot of limitations. Moonlight Maze strictly ran from 1996 to 1999 before the code name was changed, before the intrusion set was changed. Also, we have a snapshot only of 6 months when they were using this particular relay site from the end of 98 to 99. And as Danny was mentioning, it starts to look like our visibility starts to fray. They start to use other protocols, and we didn't necessarily know why. So as we're starting to analyze some of the binaries, we started to figure out why. Yeah, they like sniffers, but actually they had a different favorite tool. So at some point in 1996, Alhambra and Damon 9 wrote a tool called Loki 2. This was a covert channel backdoor that was meant to tunnel things through ICMP and other like rare protocols. And they released it in FRAC, and these guys loved it. So they picked it up, they tried this sort of first level where you can see LC, like that was the Loki daemon, and they wrote a specific client for it, an ICMP redirector that they called Spy Client. They were very excited about it, and it seemed to work well, so they went on to create a second evolution where they started to obfuscate some of the error messages and shorten some of the strings and remove any references to Loki so that anybody that might be grepping or looking through strings in order to find a backdoor wouldn't notice that they were there. So you can see some of the cat and mouse between the original investigators and these guys. And then they went on to make another version where they actually wrote, and this is the key thing for our fraying visibility, they wrote some of their own functionality. They created a sort of put-get functionality that they added into this. So that would have allowed them to retrieve files and place files into specific IPs and ports that were also infected. And then they liked it so much, and they were starting to learn a little bit about OPSEC, as we saw, that they actually added a log cleaner called UTM-PRM straight into the Loki binary. So you can actually see a tree of their adoption of Loki 2 and what they start adding to it and how much they start kind of combining. And it's kind of interesting because it means that you start to see how this old school script kiddie from the 90s starts to turn into the kind of attacker that has their own malware family and has their own sort of favorite toolkit that starts kind of developing on its own. Now, let's zoom way into the future and talk about something that happens in 2014. 2014, Kostin and Kurt and the folks at Great found something interesting that they chose to call PENQUIN TURLA. And the thing about PENQUIN TURLA is it's actually a Linux backdoor, which was fairly interesting. And this is something that sort of started to fire a lot of alarms when I talked to Thomas, and he told me that Moonlight Maze was actually a Solaris/Unix attack. Because at this point, this is probably the only TURLA that we'd seen that wasn't Windows-based. Some people here might be able to correct me, but I believe this is the only TURLA that we've seen that isn't Windows-based. So we went and took a second look at PENQUIN TURLA. And there's a few interesting things to mention there. First of all, it's based on Loki 2 as well, which you might remember from the previous tree. Sure, Loki 2 is an open source backdoor, but we're talking about a 20-year-old open source backdoor. So if anybody here can tell me about any APT attackers that might be using 20-year-old source code in their toolkits, let's talk. But that's fairly rare. And the reason, when you look at PENQUIN TURLA again, and you start to check some of the statically linked binaries and the kernels that they were linked for, it basically gives us an idea that PENQUIN TURLA was developed sometime between 1999 and 2004, and then leveraged in attacks in 2011 and 2014, 2016, which is quite interesting. So our working hypothesis is that that this is the missing link, that this is where you start to connect the Moonlight Maze operations to modern TURLA. And if you want to look at some of the things that we found that sort of kind of correlate, there is this trend of development that fits nicely from the 1998 and 99 samples going into this code base that was developed in 99, 2004.
like to use, both malwares, when they start up, the first thing they do is they check a hard-coded file for instructions and configuration, which back in the Moonlight Maze days was their version of automation. They had nothing else other than to just come in, drop a file with the configurations, and that way they could take 1,600 machines, or however many they were orchestrating with this, and not have to go configuring one by one. Similarly, all the strings that were shortened and eventually removed from the Moonlight Maze version of Loki 2 are not in the PENQUIN TURLA version. And all of the command line switches, which started to be removed and altered in the old version in Moonlight Maze, are not in PENQUIN either. So these are some of the things that we kind of put out there as an argument for. This is not just them picking up, I saw some, you can take the picture. There we go, all right. These are some of the things that, sort of point us in the right direction of this trend of development. Oh, give me 2 minutes. Here, basically, you get this sort of idea of what the timeline is like. So you've got 1996 and 99 Moonlight Maze. In 2011, you've got the RUAG incident, which is the first in-the-wild use of PENQUIN TURLA in Switzerland against a defense contractor. The latest sample that we found was actually last month, which is quite rare. We've only found about 7 samples of PENQUIN TURLA, variants included. So what we're trying to figure out is basically what's happening in this 1999 to 2003, 2004 mystery. What is the question mark there? Because our visibility ends, and in order to make this perfect claim in our parallel investigation, in order to make this solid claim of continuity, we essentially need to know what happens in that crucial time. And that's where another codename operation pops up, which is called Storm Cloud. And the idea is, as soon as, in 1999 is when the first media reports of Moonlight Maze essentially come out to the public. And our attackers freak out. They burn all of their infrastructure. It's actually why they stopped using the relay that we got all of our visibility from. They stopped using HR Test. And as part of it, the reports include, they bolstered their toolkit. They made a better general intrusion set. And it was still based on Loki 2. So what we expect is for Stormcloud to hold the answers to that perfect connection. And we've got this trend of development moving in the right direction. So we took the SAS in 2016. And Thomas came up and he told his research and he shared with you guys what he'd found. And that enabled us to find David. It gave us the visibility in order to discover HR Tests. Now we're coming to you to not only tell this great story, to show you our research for the past 9 months, but also because we once again need to tap the larger InfoSec community. We need to reach people out there and say, if there's anybody out there, if there's another David Hedges out there with visibility into Stormcloud, this is our chance to understand one of the best modern attackers and essentially place them into the League of Titans, which until now only has one group in it, which is the Equation group. The only group active since 1996. If we can perfectly link these, if we can get visibility into Stormcloud and see that development of Loki 2 coming from 1997, 98, all the way to 2017, we're talking about yet another attacker entering the League of Titans along with Equation.